Okay, gang, we're going to do a real quick review of the information that we covered last time. Whenever we were just starting muscle tissue, this will give you a good introduction to the next two videos, which are all of the muscle physiology, and these will also be found on YouTube. So we very quickly went through all the different functions of skeletal muscles and what they did. For the body, we talked about each skeletal muscle being an organ, and that organs, of course, are made of tissues. So we went through all of the different types of tissues. Of course, the skeletal muscle tissues, which would be composed of muscle cells and muscle fibers, which are the same thing. And they're being arranged in little groups called fascicles, and each fascicle would contain somewhere around 15 to 20 25 muscle cells bundled up together into one fasciculus. Then we talked about the connective tissues. We talked about endomysium, and we said that endomysium covers each individual cell. We said perimysium was a layer of connective tissue that covers each fasciculus, and that the epimysium was a layer of connective tissue that covers the entire muscle. And then superficial to that, you would have the fascia, which would cover the entire structure, and then also kind of fills in between the muscles. And then tendons, of course, attach muscle to bone. And we said that a specialized type of tendon is what's called an aponeurosis, which is a broad, flat, sheet-like tendon that, again, typically connects muscle to muscle. And we'll name a few of these when we get started down on the muscles. And then finally, built into the muscle will be blood vessels, because obviously they're going to be using lots and lots of energy, so they'll need a good supply of blood. So those are built right into the muscle themselves. And then, of course, they need to know when to contract, so there will be nerves that are connected up to them. And again, these are also built into the muscle. So there's the diagram we were using from OpenStax, showing you, again, kind of blowing it up each time and talking about those different tissue layers. All right, this is where we're kind of starting the new stuff. The term just some definitions here. The term sarcoplasm is basically just the cytoplasm of the muscle cell. So again, it's just cytoplasm, nothing different. Remember, we said cytoplasm was a combination of the cytosol, which was the liquid, plus the various organelles. So we just use a little different term when we get to muscles. We don't just call it cytoplasm, we call it sarcoplasm. The sarcolemma, again, is just the plasma membrane. So it's just that covering that's on the outside. Again, not any different than the typical plasma membrane of most cells, with some minor modifications, and we'll look at those as we get through these slides. Built into the sarcolemma will be T-tubules, what are called transverse tubules, and these are pockets that will extend down into the sarcolemma, into the interior of the cell. So they're going to form tubes that go down into that sarcolemma. And as we talk about later on, this is where the signal will travel down. The sarcolemma and the transverse tubules are going to contain sodium-potassium pumps, and you'll recall we talked about sodium-potassium pumps, this ion exchange. And as we talked about, we're going to move 3 sodiums out and 2 potassiums in for every cycle of that sodium-potassium pump. Now, I'm not going to go into the full details of how the resting membrane potential is created. We're going to pick that up in a later chapter. Right now, all I want you to know is that when the muscle cell is at rest, it will have a resting membrane potential of about minus 90 millivolts, so that the inside of the cell is 90 millivolts less negative than the fluid that's on the outside, that extracellular fluid. Now, I put that it creates that resting membrane potential, and it doesn't really create it as much as it's going to actually help it reestablish resting membrane potential. But again, we'll talk about that later on. So here again, we're looking at a blow-up of a single muscle cell. You can see the sarcoplasmic reticulum that is going to be used for storing the calcium ions, and we'll talk about that. And there are these tubes that will extend down into the interior of the cell that's going to be adjacent to these sarcoplasmic reticulum that's going to tell it when to release that calcium ion. And we'll cover that in a little bit. There's a nice shot of the sarcolemma. Again, just plasma membrane. You can plainly see the transverse tubules, those holes that extend down into the interior of the cell. And you can see how it goes into the cell adjacent to this sarcoplasmic reticulum that stores the calcium ions. So here's a brand new organelle. Again, we talked about sarcoplasmic or endoplasmic reticulum. This is sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's very, very similar to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum that we talked about earlier. They're going to surround these contractile proteins that we'll talk about in just a minute, the myosin and actin filaments, and we'll talk about those in just a second, actually in the next YouTube video. And these sarcoplasmic reticulum organelles are used for storing the calcium ions that the muscle cell is going to use to actually initiate a contraction of the muscle. So again, all that calcium is stored in this sarcoplasmic reticulum that is adjacent to these transverse tubules built into the sarcolemma. Alright, right here is where you're going to pick up on the next YouTube video, and it'll explain all exactly how that muscle cell is made up of myofibrils and myofilaments, and it'll talk about the two different types of filaments.